that Isaac that Isaac uh, dug for many years. He eventually did buy land, and this is sort of a question because as we were doing this exhibit, we were trying to take these old family stories and see if we could verify some of the
Mm-hmm.
information. Uh, I had seen some articles that said that he, over his lifetime, bought 400 acres. The family said he bought 4,000. Uh, and Eugene, I'll let you take that from there.
Well, the one plat book we have with his property on it, and this is just a snapshot at that point, shows 180 acres, and that includes the mine.
Mm-hmm. So he actually he bought the land for a mine and had the mine as his.
Yes.
The article says that he owned the land until it was mined out. What did the family then keep the land? Did they sell it off for something else? Did the record show what happened?
Well, the records that we've been able to find out is that he had two stepsons that were not his children, that were his wife's
Mm-hmm.
children, and one of them was named Lee Gentry, and when on emancipation he changed his name to Lee Generley,
Okay.
and he became a farmer, and eventually the land that Mr. Renfro had purchased got into the Generley family, and they kept the land and they farmed the land until at least the early 1900s, 1930s, when one of the gentlemen who was a grandson of Lee Generley's, uh, he was out of town. He basically lost it at a tax sale
Okay.
because he was off doing something entirely different.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to insert one of the things that was difficult in researching this, and you just heard about a gentleman changing his name voluntarily, but the last name of a slave typically changed when you changed owner.
Okay.
So that's another complication in that you often find the same individual with two, three, four names, which makes it really hard to kind of trace.
And the record keeping was not back then what it is today as well.
Yeah, and I'm trying to think, and yes, within that, generally, clan, there is one pair that had 14 children. So I don't know that all of them survived because infant mortality was a lot higher back then.
Sure.
But whatever the original size of the property, once you start dividing it up, pretty much after several generations, there's not this huge tract of land anymore.
Yeah, everybody gets a handful of acres, which they can't do anything with, and then either one buys out the other, or the whole thing just goes away.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
He
Mm-hmm.
also bought some land actually in town in St. Clair, and then later on in life gave part of it for a church and part of it for the cemetery for the church, because we found some place that says Mrs. Isaac Renfro's land.
Mm-hmm.
So is that church and cemetery there today?
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, that's true of another one. And Joe mentioned about Mr. Isaac Renfro bringing it. Basically, and there's male names. I don't know the name of Isaac's wife. Joe could fill me in. And oh gosh, the other man's wife. His name is escaping me. I think it was Christy or Charity, but the Samuel Clay, who was the father of Squire Lacey Clay. I mean, pretty much all of the families that we've researched go back to one of those two pairs, Isaac and his wife, and Samuel Clay and his wife.
Well, now, do the records show where the Clay family left Franklin County and went to St. Louis, or maybe just some of them left and some of them went to
Well,
St.
just
Louis?
some of them left because quite a few of them are still there.
Okay.
And Samuel Clay came from Kentucky, like Joe was saying. I think it was Kentucky. And his wife was Virginia, wasn't it? From Virginia?
Yes. And Isaac Renfro's wife was named Brintha.
Oh.
So this information that you were able to gather for the museum on the African Americans who lived in Franklin County in the St. Clair area, was this primarily family stories handed down throughout the ages? Did they have documents? How did you learn all this information? Because I'm sure you just didn't open up a newspaper and start reading about it. You had to start. Where did you start?
Eugene, why don't you tell about the video? Because I think that will answer his question.
Well, I mean, a lot of it did come from family stories, which were supplied by Netley, and she'd looked up some stuff in the slave schedule that Joe mentioned earlier. Another lady who's no longer with the museum but's written a lot of Franklin County history was Sue Blessy, and she had some things. And when you say newspapers.com, I had some references. And I went back and I looked them up and was able to get some clippings out of them. And the museum had purchased 3 reproductions of historic plat books, which proved out to be helpful in tracing where the families were and things like how much acreage. And I mentioned someone else. There was it was George Bland gave property for the Robertsville Temple Church and the Drake School, which was a black school back when it was separate and not equal. But that's pretty much what I did, and I did a lot of searching. Joe's got an account on Ancestry.com, and the museum had photocopies from a family Bible with marriages and births and deaths in it, and I also did get the death certificate of Squire Lacey Clay, I think it was, which also gave his birth date and the names of his parents and where they were from, and his birthplace, which was New Haven. And so, we just kept working at it. Hopefully, and having worked with museums before, this will be a seed and more stories will walk through the door. And then it's obviously not just African American stories. The community has been really responsive to rebuilding the museum after the fire, but it's mainly been donations of objects and cash, which has been very helpful. But history, unless you want to go back to the names and dates, which everybody hated, history is stories. Mm-hmm. And so if this gets more stories coming in the door, that'll help enrich the museum collection.
Well, and the way the Missourian article reads, and I think I know you two well enough to know how you would present this. This is not a story. This is not so much about the black people of Franklin County. This is about the people of Franklin County, and some of them were black.
Yes.
Yeah, and to me that's extra important because it's always been a pet peeve of mine if we have history, and then we have black history, and then we have Native American history, and we have Asian American history. It's all American history. But if you have American history, you also have to include not so much separate, but as a not a separate part, but as a part together with the rest of the history about people of color, because
Well,
once upon a time, people of color had to stay by themselves. They weren't allowed to integrate through society. So they were segregated, and so their history was kind of segregated once upon a time.
well, and once upon a time, geography just did it. But the world is so connected together now, with it basically being reduced to hours to get anywhere on the planet. Sometimes
sure.
the hours that you know, you may argue that what someone did in the Qin dynasty in China didn't have a lot of effect on what was happening in Bronze Age Britain, but nowadays it's all history is all of ours history, because it all contributed to the world we live in today.
Well, and the world we live in today is so much smaller. I mean, we were talking about how are we going to do this podcast, and Joe said, well, we could come on out sometime. I said, well, yeah, you could, but let's just do it by phone. That makes it easier for everybody, and which basically shaves what, an hour here and an hour back off of your trip, and that's about it. If back then you're talking about days here and days back.
I'll let Joe jump back in, but I did want to say one thing. And a person said this during the Black Lives Matter, and of course there was this kind of counter everybody's lives matter. And yes, the response was yes, everybody's lives matter. The important point of Black Lives Matter is for so long Black lives did not matter.
Good point.
And that's the same thing with the history. But it's all part of our history. It's just that it's been ignored so long.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Joe, I think you...
Yeah, one thing before we get too far away from the "it's a small world" theme here. There's a lady who lives in Los Angeles. She's a real estate dealer out there. Her name is Mariko Peggs,
mm-hmm.
and she just got a PhD. Her dissertation was on how slavery in Missouri differed from slavery in the Deep South. And she is also a member of this extended family. I've met her. She's been coming in during the summer to do research with her cousins. But, she's got her PhD from the University of Berkeley now. During this research we did, Netley sent her an email and says, hey, you got a picture of Isaac Renfro? Yeah. And because nobody in the museum had seen a picture of this gentleman.
Mm-hmm.
We'd heard the story for literally decades. The people in St. Clair have kept that story alive. But, she basically, and Mariko emailed her a photo of the gentleman. So, that's the thing that's kind of interesting. And the other thing is true, because in order to, we weren't, and don't please get us wrong. We weren't trying to, minimize the family stories. We're trying to tell the family stories.
Mm-hmm.
But being a museum, you also want to try to validate stories if you can. And that's the reason for the research that we did. Once you go look at local histories, I've got a local history here on the centennial of Union. There's absolutely nothing in there about people of color. Nothing.
And there certainly were people of color living in Union back then.
Exactly. And people just, in years past, they just didn't, put that into the history books. And that's the reason that folks, are scrabbling through old newspapers and one story that was actually put into the paper back in October, before we even had a dream that we were going to be doing this. Carla and I went to the history fair that Franklin County History Society has every fall, and there was a gentleman that came up to us, and he kept asking if we knew anything about the town of Derry, if we knew anything about the There was supposed to be a railroad stop by his